Listen carefully, Netanyahu. You attempted to silence my stand on the ICC and the collapse of Western moral authority. You threatened Burkina Faso through diplomatic channels, demanding I stop condemning your war crimes in Gaza. You thought I'd bow to pressure like other African leaders. You've silenced over what I say about 40,000 dead Palestinians. You were wrong. I'm amplifying every word about your genocide, every murdered child, every destroyed hospital, every starved civilian. This is my final call. I'm destroying your legitimacy across our 54 African nations, and you cannot stop me. Let me tell you exactly what happened. The International Court of Justice issued arrest warrants against you, Benjamin Netanyahu, on the 21st of November 2025, charging you with war crimes and crimes against humanity for your military operations in Gaza. The ICC prosecutor presented overwhelming evidence. Over 40,000 Palestinians killed, including over 15,000 children. Over 70% of Gaza's buildings destroyed or damaged. Systematic targeting of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools. Deliberate starvation of civilian populations through blockade and restriction of humanitarian aid, and collective punishment of 2.3 million Palestinians trapped in Gaza. The ICC judges reviewed this evidence and concluded there are reasonable grounds to believe you committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, making you the first leader of a Western-backed nation to face ICC arrest warrants while in office. I publicly supported the ICC decision immediately and called for your arrest if you ever set foot on African soil. I stated that any African nation hosting you while ICC arrest warrants are active would be complicit in protecting a war criminal from international justice. I called on all 54 African nations to commit to arresting you and transferring you to The Hague if you attempt visiting our continent. I condemned Western nations refusing to enforce ICC warrants as exposing their selective application of international law, proving they believe international justice applies only to African and non-Western leaders, while Western allies enjoy complete impunity regardless of their crimes. Within days of my public statements, your government deployed diplomatic pressure, attempting to silence me. Israeli diplomats contacted Burkinabe officials warning of consequences if I continued condemning Israeli operations in Gaza. Israeli officials threatened to mobilize Western allies to impose diplomatic isolation and economic pressure on Burkina Faso. Israeli media portrayed me as anti-Semitic and extremist, the standard smear tactic Israel deploys against anyone criticizing Israeli war crimes. Your threats failed completely because I don't fear Israeli pressure, and I don't require Israeli or Western approval to speak truth about genocide. Listen why the ICC arrest warrants against you represent a historic moment exposing Western moral authority's complete collapse. For decades, Western nations portrayed themselves as champions of human rights, international law, and humanitarian values. Western officials lectured non-Western nations about respecting international institutions, complying with international court rulings, and upholding universal human rights standards. Western powers established the International Criminal Court specifically to prosecute individuals responsible for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, claiming these crimes were so serious that no leader should enjoy impunity regardless of their position or power. But when the ICC issued arrest warrants against you, a leader of a Western-backed nation committing crimes against a non-Western population, Western nations immediately rejected the court's authority and refused to enforce the warrants. The United States condemned the ICC decision as outrageous and threatened to sanction ICC officials. Britain expressed concerns about the arrest warrants undermining Israeli security. Germany declared it wouldn't arrest you if you visited German territory because of Germany's special relationship with Israel. France made ambiguous statements avoiding commitment to enforce ICC warrants. Canada, Australia, and other Western nations similarly refused to clearly commit to arresting you despite being ICC member states legally obligated to enforce court decisions. This Western refusal to enforce ICC arrest warrants against you demolished any remaining credibility Western moral authority possessed. Western nations revealed they believe international law applies selectively, binding non-Western nations but optional for Western allies. They exposed that their supposed commitment to human rights and justice was propaganda, justifying Western intervention in non-Western nations rather than genuine universal principles. They demonstrated that Palestinian lives matter less than maintaining Western geopolitical alliances, making Western humanitarian rhetoric obvious hypocrisy. They proved that Western-dominated international institutions serve Western interests rather than universal justice. I'm telling you, this collapse of Western moral authority creates historic opportunities for formerly colonized nations to reject Western lectures and Western interference completely. For decades, Western powers used supposed moral superiority to justify intervening in our affairs, imposing conditions on our governments, and claiming authority to judge our actions. They invaded countries citing humanitarian concerns. They imposed sanctions claiming to promote human rights. They funded opposition movements claiming to support democracy. They lectured us constantly about governance, rights, and international law, implying Western nations represented higher moral standards we should emulate. But your Gaza operations and Western responses demolished this moral superiority permanently. Western nations that invaded Iraq, citing humanitarian concerns, remain silent while you kill 15,000 Palestinian children. Western nations that impose sanctions on African leaders for far less violence refuse to sanction Israel despite overwhelming evidence of war crimes. Western nations that lecture Africa about democracy and human rights provide unlimited military aid, supporting your collective punishment of Palestinian civilians. Western nations that claim to champion international law reject ICC jurisdiction when it targets their ally rather than African leaders. This blatant double standard proves Western moral authority was always fraudulent, a propaganda tool justifying Western domination rather than genuine commitment to universal values. We African leaders now have irrefutable evidence exposing Western hypocrisy whenever Western officials attempt lecturing us about human rights, democracy, or international law. When Western diplomats criticize African governance, we cite their support for Israeli war crimes. When Western politicians condemn African leaders, we reference their refusal to arrest you despite ICC warrants. When Western media portrays African conflicts as uniquely barbaric, we compare casualty figures to your Gaza operations. Western moral authority collapsed completely, and we're exploiting that collapse to reject Western interference permanently. Your threats attempting to silence my condemnation of Israeli war crimes backfired catastrophically because they demonstrated exactly the impunity and arrogance the ICC warrants addressed. You believe you can commit genocide against Palestinians, face international criminal charges, and still dictate what African leaders are permitted to say about your crimes. This arrogance is breathtaking but entirely consistent with Israeli and Western attitudes toward international law and non-Western peoples. You believe rules apply to others, but not to you. You believe African leaders should remain silent about genocide because speaking truth threatens Israeli interests. You believe your Western backing gives you authority to punish African nations that refuse complicity in your crimes. But I'm a military leader commanding a sovereign nation, not a puppet you can threaten into submission. I deployed Burkinabe forces to expel French and American military presence from our territory despite Western threats. I terminated Western military agreements despite diplomatic pressure. I partnered with Russia despite Western sanctions threats. I rejected IMF conditions despite economic warnings. Your threats carry no weight because I've already proven my government fears no Western pressure and accepts no Western authority over Burkinabe's sovereignty and policy. Threatening me only strengthens my resolve to condemn your genocide and to expose Western complicity in Palestinian suffering. Listen, the specific war crimes and crimes against humanity the ICC charged you with committing. The ICC prosecutor documented systematic attacks on civilian populations in Gaza, including bombing of residential buildings, hospitals, schools, and refugee camps. The court found evidence of deliberate targeting of humanitarian workers, journalists, and medical personnel. The ICC documented your government's blockade restricting food, water, medicine, and fuel to Gaza, creating conditions of starvation and medical crisis among civilian populations. The court examined evidence of collective punishment policies, treating all Palestinians in Gaza as legitimate targets regardless of individual conduct or involvement in hostilities. The ICC prosecutor presented casualty figures demonstrating the devastating impact of your military operations. Over 40,000 Palestinians killed as of the warrant issuance in November 2025, over 15,000 of those killed being children under age 18, over 10,000 women killed, thousands more missing and presumed dead under rubble. The court reviewed destruction data showing over 70% of Gaza's buildings damaged or destroyed, over 80% of Gaza's population displaced from their homes, complete destruction of neighborhoods that previously housed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. The ICC examined humanitarian reports documenting collapse of Gaza's healthcare system with hospitals destroyed or non-functional, widespread malnutrition, especially among children, disease outbreaks due to destroyed sanitation infrastructure, and medical crises affecting tens of thousands unable to receive treatment. This evidence led ICC judges to conclude there are reasonable grounds to believe you bear criminal responsibility for war crimes including willful killing, intentionally directing attacks against civilians, and using starvation as a method of warfare. The court also found reasonable grounds for charges of crimes against humanity including murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts. These aren't minor technical violations, they're the most serious crimes under international law, comparable to charges previously brought against leaders of Nazi Germany, former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and Sudan. The ICC determined your actions warrant the same international criminal prosecution as history's most notorious war criminals. Yet Western nations that championed ICC prosecution of African leaders suddenly discovered concerns about the court's jurisdiction, methodology, and legitimacy when it targeted their ally. American officials who praised ICC warrants against Omar al-Bashir of Sudan condemned ICC warrants against you as politically motivated. European leaders who demanded African compliance with ICC rulings expressed reservations about enforcing rulings against Israeli leaders. Western media that portrayed ICC as essential tool for international justice questioned whether the court overstepped its authority by charging you. This selective outrage exposed Western commitment to international justice as complete fraud. They support international law only when it targets their enemies, not when it holds their allies accountable. My condemnation of your war crimes and Western complicity serves multiple strategic purposes beyond expressing moral outrage. First, it demonstrates to Burkinabe populations and African peoples that their government refuses complicity in genocide and won't be silenced by Western threats. African populations overwhelmingly support Palestinians and condemn Israeli operations in Gaza. African historical experience with colonialism, apartheid, and Western violence creates natural solidarity with Palestinians suffering under Israeli occupation and military assault. By condemning your crimes explicitly and rejecting your threats publicly, I strengthen my government's legitimacy with populations demanding their leaders speak truth regardless of Western pressure. Second, my stand exposes the fraudulent nature of Western moral authority and Western-dominated international institutions. Every time Western officials lecture Africa about human rights while refusing to enforce ICC warrants against you, I cite that hypocrisy to discredit Western interference. Every time Western media portrays African conflicts as uniquely barbaric while minimizing your killing of 15,000 Palestinian children, I use that double standard to reject Western narratives. Every time Western diplomats threaten consequences for African nations' partnerships with Russia or China, I reference Western military aid to Israel despite ICC war crimes charges to demonstrate Western selective morality. Your Gaza operations and Western responses provide perfect evidence exposing Western hypocrisy, evidence I deploy strategically to undermine Western influence in Africa. Third, supporting Palestinian rights and condemning Israeli crimes aligns Burkina Faso with the Global South majority rejecting Western domination. Most African, Asian, Latin American, and Middle Eastern nations support Palestinian statehood and condemn Israeli occupation. Most Global South nations recognize Israeli treatment of Palestinians as apartheid and colonial oppression. Most formerly colonized peoples see parallels between their historical struggles against Western imperialism and contemporary Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. By standing firmly with Palestine and against Israeli war crimes, Burkina Faso strengthens relationships with Global South nations and positions itself as part of the anti-imperialist coalition challenging Western hegemony. Fourth, my refusal to be silenced by your threats demonstrates to other African leaders that defying Israeli and Western pressure is viable and strategic. Many African leaders privately support Palestinians but remain publicly silent because they fear Israeli lobbying, Western diplomatic pressure, or accusations of anti-Semitism. My public condemnation, despite your threats, proves that African leaders can speak truth about Israeli crimes without catastrophic consequences. As other African leaders observe that Burkina Faso maintains stability and strengthens Global South partnerships despite Israeli displeasure, they'll gain confidence to similarly condemn Israeli war crimes publicly. My stand creates precedent inspiring broader African rejection of Israeli impunity. Listen how accusations of anti-Semitism are weaponized to silence legitimate criticism of Israeli war crimes and policies. Whenever anyone, including African leaders, Western activists, or Jewish critics of Israeli policies, condemns Israeli military operations, occupation, or apartheid, Israeli officials and supporters immediately accuse them of anti-Semitism. This tactic deliberately conflates criticism of Israeli government policies with hatred of Jewish people, falsely portraying legitimate political opposition to Israeli actions as religious or ethnic bigotry. The goal is silencing criticism by making critics fear social, professional, or political consequences of being labeled anti-Semitic. But condemning your war crimes in Gaza isn't anti-Semitism, it's opposition to genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity regardless of perpetrator's identity. Anti-Semitism is hatred or discrimination against Jewish people because of their Jewish identity. Condemning Israeli killing of 15,000 Palestinian children is opposition to mass killing of children. Anti-Semitism is denying Jewish people equal rights or dignity. Condemning Israeli apartheid, treating Palestinians as second-class subjects, is opposition to systematic discrimination. Anti-Semitism is conspiracy theories about Jewish people controlling world affairs. Demanding ICC enforcement of arrest warrants against you is supporting international criminal justice. These are fundamentally different, and weaponizing anti-Semitism accusations to shield Israeli war crimes from criticism is morally obscene. I refuse to be intimidated by false anti-Semitism accusations because my condemnation of Israeli crimes is based on evidence, international law, and universal human rights principles. I condemn your killing of Palestinian children the same way I condemn any leader killing children, because killing children is a war crime regardless of who commits it. I condemn Israeli apartheid the same way African leaders condemned South African apartheid, because systematic racial discrimination and oppression is wrong regardless of perpetrator. I demand your arrest under ICC warrants the same way I support arresting any leader charged with war crimes, because no leader should enjoy impunity for crimes against humanity. The weaponization of anti-Semitism accusations to silence Palestinian solidarity demonstrates Israeli and Western desperation to prevent growing international condemnation of Israeli policies. As more people globally recognize Israeli treatment of Palestinians as apartheid, occupation, and colonialism, Israeli officials escalate false anti-Semitism accusations to intimidate critics into silence. As ICC, International Court of Justice, UN agencies, and major human rights organizations document Israeli war crimes and apartheid, Israeli supporters claim these institutions are biased or anti-Semitic to discredit their findings. As university students, activists, and political movements demand Palestinian rights and Israeli accountability, Israeli lobbying organizations work to punish and silence them through anti-Semitism accusations, but this strategy is failing because too much evidence of Israeli crimes is now documented and too many people understand the difference between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of Israeli policies. The ICC arrest warrants represent independent judicial determination by international judges reviewing evidence, not anti-Semitic bias. The International Court of Justice ruled Israeli occupation illegal and apartheid in July 2025 based on international law, not anti-Semitic prejudice. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem all documented Israeli apartheid through rigorous research, not anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Growing global condemnation of Israeli treatment of Palestinians reflects evidence-based assessment of Israeli policies, not anti-Semitic hatred. I'm immunized against false anti-Semitism accusations because my criticism is based on documented facts, international law, and universal principles I apply consistently regardless of perpetrator. I condemned American war crimes in Iraq, French war crimes in Africa, Russian actions in Ukraine that violate international law, and any other violations of international humanitarian law regardless of the perpetrator's identity. My condemnation of Israeli crimes is consistent with this principled opposition to war crimes, apartheid, and violations of human rights. Accusing me of anti-Semitism for condemning your killing of 15,000 Palestinian children is absurd propaganda that no honest person takes seriously. Western moral authority collapsed completely when Western nations revealed they believe Palestinian lives matter less than maintaining alliance with Israel. This isn't subtle, it's explicit in Western policy and rhetoric. American officials who expressed outrage over Russian bombing of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure remain silent about your destruction of 70% of Gaza's buildings. European leaders who condemned the Syrian government for attacking civilians in opposition areas provide military aid supporting your attacks on Palestinian civilians. Western media that extensively covered Ukrainian child casualties minimize or ignore 15,000 Palestinian children you killed. Western human rights organizations that demanded accountability for atrocities in Africa, Asia, and Latin America equivocate about clearly documented Israeli war crimes. This racial and political double standard proves Western humanitarian concerns are selective propaganda rather than genuine universal values. Western nations care about civilian casualties when Russia, China, or non-Western nations cause them, but ignore or justify civilian casualties when Israel or Western allies cause them. Western officials condemn violations of international law by nations challenging Western interests, but defend or excuse violations by nations serving Western strategic priorities. Western media extensively covers atrocities by Western enemies, but minimizes or rationalizes atrocities by Western allies. This pattern demonstrates that Western moral authority was always a weapon of Western power, rather than genuine commitment to justice and human rights. As a military leader responsible for Burkinabe's sovereignty and dignity, I cannot and will not participate in this fraudulent system. I won't remain silent about genocide because the perpetrator is Western-backed and the victims are non-Western. I won't pretend international law is legitimate when it's enforced selectively against African leaders but ignored when Western allies commit crimes. I won't accept Western lectures about human rights while Western nations arm and support your collective punishment of Palestinians. I won't be intimidated by threats from a war criminal facing ICC arrest warrants who believes he can dictate what African leaders are permitted to say about his crimes. My stand on the ICC and Palestinian rights is permanent and non-negotiable. Burkina Faso will support ICC prosecution of all leaders charged with war crimes, including you. We'll condemn Israeli war crimes and apartheid regardless of Israeli or Western pressure. We'll support Palestinian self-determination and statehood. We'll reject any attempt by Israel or Western allies to punish African nations for supporting Palestinian rights. We'll build partnerships with other African and global South nations demanding Israeli accountability. We'll use Israeli war crimes and Western complicity as evidence exposing Western moral authority's collapse whenever Western officials attempt lecturing us about governance or human rights. Your attempt to silence me failed completely, and your threats only strengthen my determination to amplify condemnation of your crimes. Every threat you issue proves the ICC was correct to charge you with crimes demonstrating contempt for international law and human dignity. Every diplomatic pressure tactic you deploy demonstrates the arrogance and impunity the international community must challenge. Every false anti-Semitism accusation you direct at Palestinian solidarity reveals your desperation to avoid accountability. You cannot silence me because I command a sovereign military power that fears no threats and accepts no foreign authority over our speech or policy. The collapse of Western moral authority creates historic opportunities for formerly colonized nations to build alternative international systems based on genuine universal principles rather than Western interests. We must strengthen non-Western institutions including BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and regional bodies providing alternatives to Western-dominated structures. We must build economic systems reducing dependence on Western trade, finance, and aid. We must develop security partnerships with non-Western powers, reducing vulnerability to Western military pressure. We must coordinate diplomatic strategies ensuring that Western hypocrisy on Palestine and other issues is constantly exposed in international forums. We must support each other when Western powers attempt isolating nations that challenge Western interests. My stand on the ICC and Palestinian rights contributes to this broader project of building genuine multipolarity, where international law applies equally to all nations, where human rights are universal rather than selective, and where Western hypocrisy no longer goes unchallenged. Every time I condemn your war crimes despite your threats, I demonstrate that African leaders can defy Western and Israeli pressure. Every time I cite Western refusal to enforce ICC warrants against you to reject Western moral lectures, I undermine Western authority. Every time I stand with Palestine despite false anti-Semitism accusations, I inspire others to similarly refuse intimidation. This is how we dismantle Western moral authority and build genuine justice, by refusing complicity, exposing hypocrisy, and accepting no authority beyond international law applied universally. Listen what genuine multipolarity means and why my stand on Palestine is essential to building it. Multipolarity isn't just about having multiple powerful nations instead of American unipolar dominance. It's about fundamentally transforming the international system so that Western powers can no longer impose their will on the rest of the world through military force, economic coercion, or moral pretension. It means international law applies equally to all nations, regardless of their power or Western alliances. It means human rights are universal principles applied consistently rather than weapons. Western powers deploy selectively against their enemies. It means Western nations lose their self-appointed authority to judge, punish, and intervene in non-Western nations while enjoying complete impunity for their own crimes and their allies' atrocities. My condemnation of Israeli genocide in Gaza, despite your threats and despite Western pressure, directly advances this multipolarity project. Every time I speak the truth about your crimes while you attempt to silence me, I demonstrate that Western and Israeli power to control global discourse is collapsing. For decades, Western powers and Israel maintained narrative dominance through control of international media, diplomatic institutions, and financial leverage over developing nations. They could portray their military interventions as humanitarian while demonizing resistance to their dominance as terrorism or extremism. They could commit or support atrocities while maintaining international legitimacy and moral authority. They could silence critics through economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, or accusations of anti-Semitism and anti-Western bias. But that era is ending because leaders like me refuse to be silenced, and because we command nations with sufficient sovereignty and alternative partnerships to withstand Western pressure. When I condemn your genocide publicly despite Israeli diplomatic threats, I prove that African leaders can speak truth about Western-backed crimes without catastrophic consequences. When Burkina Faso maintains stability and strengthens partnerships with Russia, China, and global South nations despite Israeli and Western displeasure, I demonstrate that defying Western pressure is viable and strategic. When African populations overwhelmingly celebrate my condemnation of Israeli crimes, I show that speaking truth aligns with popular demands rather than isolating leaders from their bases of support. This demonstration effect is crucial for inspiring other African and global South leaders to similarly defy Western pressure and speak truth about Western-backed crimes. Many leaders privately oppose Israeli treatment of Palestinians, recognize Western double standards on international law, and resent Western moral lectures given Western hypocrisy. But these leaders remain publicly silent or diplomatically cautious because they fear consequences of openly challenging Western and Israeli narratives. They worry about losing Western aid, facing diplomatic isolation, suffering economic pressure through sanctions or reduced trade, or being demonized in Western media as extremist or anti-Semitic. These fears are legitimate because Western powers have historically punished nations and leaders who challenged Western interests too directly. But my successful defiance of Israeli threats demonstrates these fears are increasingly outdated because Western power to punish dissident nations is declining and alternative partnerships are emerging. Israel threatened consequences if I continued condemning Gaza operations, but what consequences actually materialized? Israeli diplomatic displeasure that carries no material impact on Burkina Faso. Western media criticism that Burkinabe populations ignore because they support my stand. Potential reduction in Israeli or Western aid that matters little because we're reducing Western economic dependence anyway and building partnerships with non-Western powers offering cooperation without political conditions. The threatened consequences prove manageable or non-existent, validating my calculation that speaking truth about Israeli crimes is strategically viable despite Western and Israeli threats. Every time I cite Western refusal to enforce ICC warrants against you to reject Western moral lectures, I undermine Western authority across Africa and the global South. This is strategic communication designed to destroy Western moral authority by exposing hypocrisy so blatant that no honest person can defend it. When Western diplomats lecture African leaders about respecting international law, I respond, "You refuse to arrest Netanyahu. Despite ICC warrants, you have no authority to lecture us about international law." When Western officials criticize African governance, I respond, "You arm genocide in Gaza while claiming to promote human rights. Your moral authority is zero." When Western media portrays African conflicts as uniquely barbaric, I respond, "Israeli operations killed 15,000 Palestinian children with Western weapons. Don't lecture us about violence." These responses aren't just rhetorical, they're strategic attacks on the ideological foundation of Western global dominance. Western power rests partly on military and economic strength, but it also depends on ideological legitimacy, the perception that Western nations represent higher moral standards and progressive values justifying Western leadership and intervention. When formerly colonized peoples accepted this ideological legitimacy, they granted Western powers moral authority to judge their actions, impose conditions on their governments, and intervene in their affairs ostensibly to promote human rights, democracy, and rule of law. This moral authority made Western domination more sustainable because it was partly consensual. Many non-Western peoples believed Western intervention might genuinely benefit them despite its costs. But Western refusal to enforce ICC warrants against you while demanding African compliance with international law demolished this moral authority. It exposed that Western commitment to international law and human rights was always selective propaganda rather than genuine universal principles. It proved Western nations believe international law binds only weaker nations, while Western allies enjoy impunity regardless of their crimes. It demonstrated Western humanitarian concerns are political weapons deployed against Western enemies rather than consistent ethical commitments. It revealed Western moral lectures are hypocrisy justifying Western interference rather than genuine efforts to promote universal values. I'm exploiting this exposure systematically to destroy Western ideological legitimacy across Africa. Every interaction with Western officials provides opportunities to cite their hypocrisy on Palestine to discredit their authority. Every Western criticism of African policies provides openings to reference their support for Israeli genocide to undermine their moral standing. Every Western media narrative about African problems provides chances to compare Palestinian suffering under Israeli occupation to expose Western selective outrage. This constant citation of Western hypocrisy on Palestine gradually erodes Western ideological legitimacy among African populations and leaders, making Western moral authority and Western intervention increasingly unsustainable. Every time I stand with Palestine despite false anti-Semitism accusations, I inspire others to similarly refuse intimidation and speak truth about Israeli crimes. The weaponization of anti-Semitism accusations to silence Palestinian solidarity is one of Israel's most effective tactics for maintaining international support despite overwhelming evidence of war crimes and apartheid. By falsely equating criticism of Israeli policies with hatred of Jewish people, Israeli officials and supporters create social, professional, and political costs for Palestinian solidarity, making many people fear speaking out despite recognizing injustice. This tactic is particularly effective in Western nations where historical guilt over the Holocaust and powerful Israeli lobbying create environments where anti-Semitism accusations can destroy careers, reputations, and political movements. But I'm immune to this intimidation tactic because I'm an African military leader commanding a sovereign nation with popular support and alternative partnerships. False anti-Semitism accusations carry no weight against me because my legitimacy comes from Burkinabe populations who overwhelmingly support Palestinians, not from Western media or Israeli approval. Israeli supporters can call me anti-Semitic. In Western press, Burkinabe populations celebrate my stand. Western commentators can claim I'm extremist. African peoples across our 54 nations praise my courage. Israeli officials can threaten diplomatic consequences. I strengthen partnerships with nations that support Palestinian rights and reject Israeli impunity. My immunity to anti-Semitism accusations demonstrates to others that this intimidation tactic loses power when leaders prioritize their population's demands over Western approval. African populations overwhelmingly support Palestinians because African historical experience with colonialism, apartheid, and Western violence creates natural solidarity with Palestinian suffering. When African leaders speak truth about Israeli crimes, they align with popular sentiment rather than alienating their bases. When African leaders stand firm against false anti-Semitism accusations, they demonstrate strength rather than extremism. When African leaders maintain stability despite Israeli and Western displeasure, they prove that defying this pressure is viable. Other African leaders are observing my successful defiance and calculating whether they can similarly speak the truth about Israeli crimes without catastrophic consequences. As they watch Burkina Faso maintain stability, strengthen global South partnerships, and enjoy popular support despite my explicit condemnation of Israeli genocide, they're concluding that speaking truth is strategically viable. As they observe that Israeli threats produce no serious consequences and that false anti-Semitism accusations carry no weight with African populations, they're recognizing that fears of speaking out were exaggerated. As they see that my stand strengthens rather than weakens my government's legitimacy and regional influence, they understand that Palestinian solidarity advances rather than undermines African leaders' interests. This is how we dismantle Western moral authority and build genuine justice by refusing complicity, exposing hypocrisy, and accepting no authority beyond international law applied universally. Refusing complicity means rejecting pressure to remain silent about Western-backed crimes or to participate in Western-dominated systems that apply international law selectively. I refused complicity when I condemned your genocide despite your threats. I refused complicity when I demanded ICC enforcement of arrest warrants against you. I refused complicity when I called for your arrest if you set foot on African soil. I refused complicity when I rejected false anti-Semitism accusations designed to silence legitimate criticism. Exposing hypocrisy means constantly citing Western double standards to undermine Western moral authority and ideological legitimacy. I expose Western hypocrisy every time I reference their refusal to enforce ICC warrants against you while demanding African compliance with international law. I expose Western hypocrisy every time I compare their extensive coverage of Ukrainian casualties to their minimization of 15,000 Palestinian children you killed. I expose Western hypocrisy every time I contrast their sanctions against Russia for actions in Ukraine with their military aid to Israel despite your documented war crimes. I expose Western hypocrisy every time I highlight their lectures about African governance while they support apartheid and genocide in Palestine. Accepting no authority beyond international law applied universally means rejecting Western claims to judge, punish, or intervene in non-Western nations, while Western allies enjoy impunity. I accept ICC authority because it's supposed to apply universally, but I reject Western selective enforcement that targets only African and non-Western leaders. I accept international humanitarian law's prohibitions on war crimes and crimes against humanity, but I reject Western violations of these laws and Western protection of allies who violate them. I accept legitimate international institutions operating impartially, but I reject Western-dominated institutions serving Western interests rather than universal justice. This principled position allows me to maintain moral high ground while attacking Western hypocrisy. I'm not rejecting international law, I'm demanding it apply equally to you and to Western nations that protect you. I'm not opposing humanitarian principles, I'm condemning Western violations of these principles in Gaza and Western support for your violations. I'm not dismissing international institutions, I'm exposing their illegitimacy when they're controlled by Western powers applying rules selectively. This principled position is unassailable because it's based on universal values Western nations claim to champion but consistently violate. You cannot silence me, Netanyahu. Your threats through diplomatic channels failed. Your government's pressure tactics failed. Your supporters' false anti-Semitism accusations failed. I'm amplifying my condemnation of your genocide in Gaza and my support for ICC prosecution of your war crimes, regardless of any consequences you threaten. The ICC issued arrest warrants based on overwhelming evidence of crimes you committed. Western nations' refusal to enforce those warrants exposed the complete collapse of Western moral authority. Your attempt to silence African criticism proved the arrogance and impunity the ICC warrants addressed. Your threats failed because you fundamentally misunderstood the sources of my power and legitimacy. You thought threatening my government would create sufficient pressure to silence me because you assumed I depend on Western or Israeli approval. But my legitimacy comes from Burkinabe populations who elected me and who overwhelmingly support my condemnation of Israeli genocide. My government's stability depends on delivering sovereignty, security, and dignity to Burkinabe peoples, not on maintaining good relations with Western powers or Israel. My strategic partnerships increasingly involve Russia, China, and global South nations, rather than Western powers whose influence in Africa is declining. Your threats couldn't create sufficient pressure because the leverage you assumed you had doesn't exist. Your government's pressure tactics failed because Western domination of Africa is collapsing and alternative partnerships are emerging. Israeli officials threaten to mobilize Western allies to impose diplomatic isolation and economic pressure on Burkina Faso. But diplomatic isolation from Western powers matters little when we're strengthening partnerships with Russia, China, Iran, and numerous African and global South nations. Economic pressure from Western powers has limited impact when we're reducing economic dependence on Western trade and aid while building alternative economic relationships. Western influence in Africa is declining because African nations are expelling Western military forces, rejecting Western economic conditions, and partnering with non-Western powers offering cooperation without domination. Your supporters' false anti-Semitism accusations failed because their transparent propaganda that African populations reject completely. Burkinabe peoples and African populations across our continent understand the difference between anti-Semitism and legitimate criticism of Israeli crimes. They know anti-Semitism is hatred of Jewish people because of their identity. They know condemning your killing of 15,000 Palestinian children is opposition to mass killing of children. They know demanding ICC enforcement of arrest warrants against you is supporting international criminal justice. They know supporting Palestinian self-determination is opposing colonial occupation and apartheid. False anti-Semitism accusations designed to intimidate Western audiences into silence carry zero weight with African populations who support Palestine and condemn Israeli crimes. The ICC arrest warrants against you represent independent judicial determination by international judges reviewing extensive evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity you committed. The ICC prosecutor documented systematic attacks on civilian populations, deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, use of starvation as a weapon through blockade, and collective punishment of Palestinian populations. The ICC judges concluded there are reasonable grounds to believe you bear criminal responsibility for war crimes, including willful killing and intentionally directing attacks against civilians, and for crimes against humanity, including murder and persecution. These aren't politically motivated accusations, they're legal determinations based on evidence of crimes you committed. Western nations' refusal to enforce ICC arrest warrants despite being legally obligated as ICC member states exposed the fraudulent nature of Western commitment to international justice. American officials who praised ICC prosecution of African leaders condemned ICC warrants against you as outrageous and threatened to sanction ICC officials. European leaders who demanded African compliance with ICC rulings expressed concerns about enforcing rulings against Israeli leaders. Western media that portrayed ICC as a central tool for accountability questioned whether the court overstepped authority by charging you. This selective outrage proved Western support for international justice extends only to prosecuting Western enemies, not holding Western allies accountable for comparable or worse crimes. Your attempt to silence my criticism through diplomatic threats and pressure tactics proved exactly the arrogance and impunity the ICC warrants addressed. You believe you can commit genocide against Palestinians, face international criminal charges documenting your crimes, and still dictate what African leaders are permitted to say about your actions. This belief reflects the same contempt for international law and non-Western peoples that characterizes your treatment of Palestinians. You believe rules apply to others but not to you. You believe African leaders should remain silent about crimes you commit because speaking truth threatens Israeli interests. You believe your Western backing gives you authority to punish African nations that refuse complicity in your crimes. This arrogance is exactly why ICC prosecution of you is necessary and why enforcement of arrest warrants is essential. My stand is permanent. Burkina Faso supports Palestinian rights and demands your accountability for war crimes. We reject Western selective application of international law. We refuse complicity in genocide regardless of perpetrator's identity or backing. We won't be intimidated by threats from a leader facing international criminal charges. Because I'm a military commander of a sovereign nation, and I accept no foreign authority dictating what I can say about crimes against humanity. My support for Palestinian rights is rooted in African historical experience and moral principles. African peoples suffered under European colonialism that stole our land, exploited our labor, extracted our resources, and denied our humanity for centuries. We fought liberation struggles against colonial occupation and achieved independence through resistance and sacrifice. We experienced apartheid in South Africa, where racist systems denied Black South Africans equal rights and dignity in their own land. We understand occupation, colonialism, apartheid, and resistance because these were our historical experiences. When we see Palestinians suffering under Israeli occupation, living under apartheid systems, resisting colonial settlement of their land, we recognize patterns we experienced ourselves. This historical solidarity creates natural African support for Palestinian liberation. African leaders, including Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, Julius Nyerere, and Thomas Sankara, consistently supported Palestinian rights because they recognized the struggle against Israeli occupation as continuation of anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggles Africans waged. Mandela stated clearly that South African freedom was incomplete while Palestinians remained oppressed, understanding that liberation struggles are interconnected and that justice requires solidarity with all oppressed peoples. African populations overwhelmingly support Palestinians, not because of religious or ethnic identification, but because of shared historical experience with colonialism and apartheid and moral commitment to opposing these systems wherever they exist. My demands for your accountability for war crimes reflect commitment to universal application of international law. If African leaders facing similar evidence of war crimes were charged by ICC, I would support their prosecution, because no leader should enjoy impunity for crimes against humanity. I supported ICC prosecution of Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, despite him being an African leader, because evidence suggested he bore responsibility for atrocities in Darfur. I would support prosecution of any African, Asian, Latin American, or Western leader credibly accused of genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. International law prohibiting these crimes must apply universally, or it's meaningless, becoming just another weapon powerful nations deploy against weaker nations while protecting themselves and their allies. ICC arrest warrants against you based on extensive evidence of crimes you committed should be enforced by all ICC member states, including Western nations. Their refusal to enforce these warrants while demanding African compliance with ICC rulings exposes that they view international law as binding only non-Western nations. This selective enforcement destroys international law's legitimacy and justifies non-Western nations' refusal to comply with Western-dominated international institutions. If international law doesn't apply to Western-backed leaders, then Western nations lose any standing to demand non-Western compliance with international legal obligations. If Western nations protect their allies from accountability for documented crimes, then they forfeit moral authority to judge or punish non-Western nations. We reject Western selective application of international law by demanding either universal enforcement or acknowledging that Western-dominated international institutions lack legitimacy. Western nations must choose: enforce ICC warrants against you and maintain international law's credibility, or admit international law applies selectively and forfeit authority to demand non-Western compliance. They cannot simultaneously refuse enforcing arrest warrants against you while maintaining that international law binds other nations. They cannot claim moral authority based on respect for international justice while protecting you from prosecution for documented crimes. Their hypocrisy is unsustainable, and we're forcing them to confront this contradiction by constantly citing their refusal to enforce warrants against you whenever they attempt lecturing us about international law. We refuse complicity in genocide regardless of perpetrator's identity or backing, because human rights are universal principles, not selective political weapons. Palestinian lives have equal value to Ukrainian, Syrian, Yemeni, or any other lives, and crimes against Palestinians deserve equal condemnation and accountability as crimes against any other people. Western nations that extensively covered Ukrainian suffering while minimizing Palestinian casualties revealed they believe some lives matter more than others based on political considerations rather than universal human dignity. Western officials who condemned Russian actions in Ukraine while arming your operations in Gaza demonstrated their humanitarian concerns are selective rather than principled. This racial and political double standard proves Western moral authority is fraudulent. We won't be intimidated by threats from a leader facing international criminal charges, because accepting such intimidation would make us complicit in your crimes and complicit in the system of impunity, protecting powerful nations and their allies from accountability. If I remain silent about your genocide because you threaten consequences, I would be participating in the same system of Western domination that oppresses African peoples. If I accepted your authority to dictate what I can say about crimes against humanity, I would be surrendering sovereignty my government exists to defend. If I prioritized avoiding Israeli or Western displeasure over speaking the truth about documented atrocities, I would be betraying Burkinabe populations and African peoples who demand their leaders stand with justice regardless of powerful nations' threats. Because I'm a military commander of a sovereign nation, and I accept no foreign authority dictating what I can say about crimes against humanity. My authority comes from Burkinabe populations who elected me and who support my government's policies, including my stand on Palestine. My legitimacy depends on defending Burkinabe sovereignty, delivering security and development, and maintaining dignity by refusing subordination to foreign powers. My strategic calculations prioritize Burkinabe interests and African solidarity rather than maintaining good relations with Western powers or Israel. Your threats carry no weight because you lack leverage over my government, and because accepting your authority would undermine rather than strengthen my legitimacy with populations whose support sustains my governance. The lesson for Western powers is clear. Your moral authority collapsed when you refused to enforce ICC warrants against your ally while demanding compliance from African nations. Your lectures about human rights ring hollow when you arm genocide. Your claims about international law are fraudulent when you ignore it selectively. We're done accepting your double standards and your authority. Western moral authority rested on the perception that Western nations represented higher standards of governance, human rights, and international law, justifying Western leadership and Western intervention to promote these values globally. This perception was always partly propaganda, but it had sufficient basis in reality that many non-Western peoples granted Western nations moral authority despite their hypocrisies. Western nations did establish democratic systems with greater political freedoms than many non-Western nations. Western nations did develop strong rule of law protecting individual rights. Western nations did create prosperity and stability that many developing nations aspired to replicate. These achievements, however flawed and built partly on colonial extraction, created the perception that Western nations had learned lessons about governance and human rights that non-Western nations should adopt. But your Gaza operations and Western responses demolished this moral authority completely. Western nations revealed they believe Palestinian lives matter less than maintaining alliance with Israel. Racial and political double standard, proving their humanitarian concerns are selective propaganda. They demonstrated their commitment to international law extends only to enforcing it against non-Western nations while protecting Western allies from accountability. They exposed that their democratic values and human rights principles apply selectively rather than universally. They proved their supposed moral superiority was always fraudulent ideological justification for Western domination rather than genuine commitment to universal values. Your lectures about human rights ring hollow when you arm genocide with billions of dollars in annual military aid. American officials who condemned human rights abuses in China, Russia, Iran, and African nations provide Israel with over $3.8 billion annually in military assistance used to kill Palestinian civilians, destroy Palestinian homes, and maintain apartheid systems denying Palestinians equal rights. European nations that lecture Africa about governance sold you weapons and military technology used in Gaza operations, killing 15,000 children. Western governments that claim to promote humanitarian values blocked UN Security Council resolutions calling for ceasefire in Gaza, prioritizing Israeli military operations over Palestinian civilian lives. This complicity in your crimes destroyed any remaining Western moral authority to judge or lecture non-Western nations about human rights. Your claims about international law are fraudulent when you ignore it selectively to protect allies while demanding non-Western compliance. Western nations that invaded Iraq violated international law prohibiting aggressive war but faced no accountability. Western nations that bombed Libya violated UN Security Council resolutions limiting intervention to civilian protection but faced no consequences. Western nations that maintain economic sanctions killing hundreds of thousands through humanitarian impact violate international humanitarian law but claim these sanctions are legitimate. Western nations refuse enforcing ICC arrest warrants against you despite being legally obligated as ICC member states but demand African nations comply with ICC rulings. This pattern proves Western commitment to international law is fraudulent. They support international law when it serves their interests and ignore it when enforcement would constrain them or their allies. We're done accepting your double standards and your authority because your hypocrisy on Palestine exposed that your moral authority was always fraudulent. We will no longer grant you standing to judge our governance when you arm genocide. We will no longer accept your lectures about human rights when you believe Palestinian lives matter less than maintaining strategic alliances. We will no longer comply with your demands regarding international law when you refuse enforcing it against your allies. We will no longer participate in Western-dominated international systems, applying rules selectively to serve Western interests. Your moral authority collapsed, and we're building alternative systems based on genuine universal principles rather than Western selective enforcement. The lesson for other African leaders is equally clear. Speaking truth about Israeli crimes is viable and necessary. Western and Israeli threats are manageable. Our populations demand we stand with Palestine. Our dignity requires we refuse complicity in genocide. Speaking truth about Israeli crimes is viable because Western power to punish dissenting African nations is declining and alternative partnerships are emerging. My government condemned Israeli genocide, demanded ICC enforcement of arrest warrants against you, and called for your arrest if you set foot on African soil, and Burkina Faso maintained stability and strengthened partnerships despite your threats. Israeli diplomatic displeasure produced no material consequences. Western criticism in media outlets Burkinabe populations ignore changed nothing domestically. Potential reduction in Israeli or Western aid mattered little because we're building partnerships with Russia, China, and other nations offering cooperation without political conditions. The threatened consequences of speaking truth proved manageable or non-existent, validating that defying Israeli and Western pressure is strategically viable. Western and Israeli threats are manageable because their leverage over African nations is declining. Western military presence in Africa is collapsing as we expel their forces from Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, and potentially other nations. Western economic leverage is declining as we reduce dependence on Western aid, reject IMF conditions, and build trade relationships with China, Russia, and global South nations. Western diplomatic isolation is meaningless when we're strengthening partnerships with nations representing majority of global population. Western media criticism carries no weight with African populations who support Palestinian rights and condemn Israeli crimes. The tools Western and Israeli officials use to pressure African leaders into silence are losing effectiveness, making speaking truth increasingly viable. Our populations demand we stand with Palestine because African peoples overwhelmingly support Palestinian rights based on shared historical experience and moral solidarity. African populations experienced colonialism, fought liberation struggles, lived under apartheid, and achieved independence through resistance. When they see Palestinians suffering under occupation, resisting colonial settlement, living under apartheid systems, they recognize patterns from African history. African populations celebrate leaders who stand with Palestine and condemn leaders who remain silent or support Israel. Speaking truth about Israeli crimes aligns African leaders with popular demands rather than alienating them from their bases, making Palestinian solidarity strategically beneficial rather than costly. Our dignity requires we refuse complicity in genocide because remaining silent about documented atrocities to avoid angering powerful nations is exactly the subordination our independence was supposed to end. African independence was supposed to mean African sovereignty, our right to govern ourselves, determine our policies, and speak our truths without requiring Western or Israeli approval. But if we remain silent about genocide because Israel threatens consequences, we're not sovereign, we're still subordinated to foreign powers dictating our speech and policies. If we accept Western double standards on international law because challenging them might reduce Western aid, we're not independent, we're still dependent on Western financial leverage to maintain compliance. Genuine sovereignty and independence require courage to defy powerful nations when they commit or support crimes, or independence is meaningless. This is the choice facing African leaders. Maintain silence to avoid angering Western powers and Israel, or speak truth defending Palestinian rights despite pressure. Maintaining silence appears safer because it avoids confrontation with powerful nations. But silence makes us complicit in genocide, subordinates us to foreign dictates limiting our sovereignty, alienates us from populations demanding we stand with Palestine, and perpetuates the system where Western and Israeli power allows them to commit crimes with impunity. Speaking truth creates confrontation with Western and Israeli officials but aligns us with our populations, strengthens our sovereignty by refusing foreign authority over our speech, demonstrates that defying Western pressure is viable, and contributes to dismantling Western moral authority, enabling their domination. My stand demonstrates that speaking truth is the strategically correct choice, viable, popular, and advancing African interests despite Western and Israeli threats. Other African leaders must follow this example if we're to achieve genuine independence and multipolarity. As more African leaders speak truth about Israeli crimes, the costs of Western and Israeli retaliation decline because they cannot punish all of us simultaneously. As we coordinate our stands, we provide mutual support against Western pressure that isolated nations cannot withstand alone. As we demonstrate speaking truth is viable, we inspire confidence among leaders who feared consequences of challenging Western and Israeli narratives. This cascade effect gradually shifts African policies from complicity in Western domination to active resistance, building the African sovereignty and power genuine independence requires. Listen how the cascade effect works and why coordinated African resistance is essential for achieving genuine independence. When one African nation stands alone challenging Western and Israeli narratives, that nation becomes vulnerable to concentrated Western pressure designed to punish dissent and deter others from following. Western powers can impose targeted sanctions on that isolated nation. They can mobilize diplomatic isolation through their allies. They can fund opposition movements internally. They can deploy media campaigns demonizing the government. They can reduce aid and investment. They can threaten military intervention directly or through proxies. This concentrated pressure can destabilize even relatively strong nations if they remain isolated without allies providing economic, diplomatic, and political support. But when multiple African nations coordinate resistance to Western domination, the dynamic transforms completely. Western powers cannot impose severe sanctions on 10 or 20 African nations simultaneously without devastating their own economies that depend on African resources and markets. They cannot mobilize effective diplomatic isolation against a coordinated bloc of African nations because that bloc represents too large a portion of international community. They cannot fund opposition movements in dozens of countries simultaneously with sufficient resources to threaten all those governments. They cannot sustain media campaigns demonizing multiple African leaders without exposing the pattern, revealing their opposition is political rather than principled. They cannot threaten military intervention against coordinated African resistance without risking catastrophic escalation and complete loss of remaining Western influence in Africa. The mathematics of resistance are simple. Western capacity to punish dissent declines as the number of dissenting nations increases. If I alone condemn Israeli genocide while other African leaders remain silent, Western powers can concentrate pressure on Burkina Faso, attempting to force my silence or destabilize my government as warning to others. But if 10 African leaders condemn Israeli genocide simultaneously, Western pressure disperses across multiple targets, reducing effectiveness against each. If 20 African nations coordinate demands for ICC enforcement of arrest warrants against Netanyahu, Western powers face choice between punishing all 20 nations impossible without catastrophic costs to Western interests or accepting that African resistance to Western selective justice is unstoppable. As more African leaders observe that speaking truth about Israeli crimes produces manageable consequences when done collectively, their calculations about costs and benefits shift dramatically. Leaders who remained silent because they feared isolated retaliation recognize that coordinated resistance reduces risks substantially. Leaders who hesitated because they worried about losing Western aid understand that Western powers cannot cut aid to dozens of African nations without losing all African influence. Leaders who avoided challenging Western narratives because they feared diplomatic isolation realize that coordinated bloc of African nations cannot be isolated because they represent too significant a portion of global community. This recognition creates cascade effect, where each additional African leader speaking truth makes it easier for next leader to follow. My stand on Palestine demonstrated that one leader can successfully defy Israeli and Western pressure. When second and third African leaders follow my example, they prove this wasn't isolated exception but viable strategy multiple nations can pursue. When 10 or 15 African leaders coordinate condemnation of Israeli crimes and demands for ICC enforcement, they demonstrate that collective resistance to Western domination is sustainable and strategically beneficial. Each additional nation joining this resistance reduces risks for all participants while increasing pressure on Western powers to either acknowledge their hypocrisy or accept complete loss of moral authority. We provide mutual support against Western pressure through coordinated diplomatic strategies, economic cooperation, reducing dependence on Western powers, and political solidarity defending each other when Western powers attempt punishment. When Western powers threaten sanctions against one African nation for condemning Israeli crimes, other African nations can threaten countermeasures including nationalizing Western corporate assets, restricting Western access to resources, or redirecting trade toward non-Western partners. When Western media demonizes one African leader for supporting Palestinian rights, other African leaders can amplify that leader's message and condemn Western propaganda. When Western officials attempt isolating one African nation diplomatically, other African nations can strengthen bilateral relationships with that nation, demonstrating isolation failed. This mutual support transforms individual nations' vulnerabilities into collective strength. Burkina Faso alone might struggle if Western powers imposed comprehensive sanctions, but if 20 African nations threatened retaliatory measures, Western powers would calculate that sanctions would cost them more than they'd gain. One African leader demonized in Western media might suffer some reputational damage internationally, but if 15 African leaders defended that leader and condemned Western propaganda, the narrative would shift from isolated extremist to courageous leader, representing broader African sentiment. One African nation facing diplomatic pressure might feel isolated, but if a coordinated bloc of African nations stood together, Western powers would recognize their isolation tactics failed. As we demonstrate speaking truth is viable through successful resistance, producing minimal negative consequences and substantial political benefits, we inspire confidence among leaders who feared challenging Western and Israeli narratives. Many African leaders privately oppose Israeli treatment of Palestinians, recognize Western double standards, and resent Western moral authority built on hypocrisy. But these leaders remained publicly silent because they believed speaking truth would produce catastrophic consequences their governments couldn't withstand. They calculated that Western retaliation through economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, or internal destabilization would outweigh benefits of speaking truth, making silence appear strategically rational despite its moral and political costs. My successful stand challenges this calculation by proving that consequences of speaking truth are manageable while benefits are substantial. Burkina Faso suffered no catastrophic consequences from condemning Israeli genocide and demanding ICC enforcement of arrest warrants. Israeli diplomatic displeasure produced no material impact. Western criticism generated no domestic political problems because Burkinabe populations supported my stand. Potential reduction in Western aid mattered little because we're building alternative partnerships. Meanwhile, benefits were significant. Strengthened legitimacy with populations demanding leaders stand with Palestine, enhanced relationships with global South nations supporting Palestinian rights, weakened Western moral authority through exposing hypocrisy, and demonstrated Burkinabe's sovereignty by refusing foreign dictates over our speech. Other African leaders observing this outcome must recalculate their cost-benefit analyses. If speaking truth produces manageable costs and substantial benefits, while silence produces complicity in genocide and continued subordination to Western authority, then speaking truth becomes strategically correct choice, even for leaders prioritizing pragmatic calculations over moral principles. As more leaders reach this conclusion and act accordingly, the cascade accelerates each additional nation. Speaking truth makes it easier for next nation to follow, until coordinated African resistance to Western domination becomes normalized rather than exceptional. This cascade effect gradually shifts African policies from complicity in Western domination to active resistance, building the African sovereignty and power genuine independence requires. Genuine independence isn't just formal sovereignty where African nations control their territories and governments. It's substantive sovereignty where African nations determine policies based on African interests rather than Western dictates. For decades after nominal independence, many African nations remained effectively subordinated to Western powers through economic dependence, military vulnerability, and psychological acceptance of Western authority. African leaders made policy calculations prioritizing Western approval, Western aid, and avoiding Western retaliation rather than purely serving African interests. But coordinated African resistance to Western domination builds substantive sovereignty by demonstrating that African nations can pursue policies serving African interests despite Western opposition. When African nations collectively condemn Israeli crimes despite Israeli and Western pressure, we prove we determine our foreign policies based on our principles and interests rather than Western approval. When African nations coordinate demands for reparations from former colonial powers, we demonstrate we define justice based on our historical experience rather than accepting Western narratives. When African nations expel Western military forces and partner with Russia and China despite Western threats, we show we control our security policies and strategic partnerships rather than deferring to Western strategic preferences.